Okay, thank you for joining us today. We have a project assistance panel now, and before I introduce the panel, I would like to introduce our amazing speakers. I would first like to start with Mona Lisa Hazarika, who is joining us from India and is up on the screen behind us. Mona Lisa is a master's student in conflict management and development at Banaras Hindu University, India, and is interested in the nexus between narco-insurgency, arms trade, and the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons. She was selected as one of 25 Leaders for Tomorrow by the UNODA, the UNODA's Youth for Disarmament initiative, to advance the role of youth in the decision-making process, and was invited to the UN headquarters in New York to present her project Across the Chicken Neck at the first committee side event held in October 2022. Currently, she's working as a project assistant at Scrap Weapons and is part of the Emerging Voices Network of BASIC. Our next speaker is Dr. Gurpreet Kaur, who is an intersectional gender specialist. She received her BA Honours and MA degrees from the National University of Singapore and her PhD from the University of Warwick. She has just completed her LLM in Human Rights, Conflict and Justice from SOAS and is now a project assistant with Scrap Weapons. We also have James Luke, who is an MSc student in political thought at SOAS and a project assistant at Scrap Weapons as well. He previously studied political science at the University of Notre Dame and has experience living and working in Hong Kong, Jerusalem, the US, France, and the UK. Luke is passionate about critical approaches to security, and his latest article, published on the Scrap Weapons opinion page, conducts a critical military analysis of a potential Taiwan Strait confrontation. He is currently interested in research of the impact of surveillance and violence on the creation of cyber ethics. Our final speaker is Indrajit Ramananand, who is currently an MSc student in international politics at SOAS. He completed his BA LLB degree at OP Jindal Global University, India, specializing in international law and politics. Indrajit is interested in the contemporary nuclear strategies in South Asia, focusing on the Indian nuclear weapons program. So we have quite the panel here today with a whole list of accomplishments. And today they will be focusing on why we need a special session on disarmament. So, the New World Order comprises multiple power blocks and is no longer split between the power dynamics of the two giants of the Cold War. Potential conflict has increased nuclear and non-nuclear weapons proliferation surrounding the Taiwan Strait, the India and Pakistan border, and India and Russia-Ukraine. Increasing gun violence and a culture of arms have intensified the former threats posed by nuclear proliferation with greater rigor and localized impacts. New and emerging technologies are blurring the demarcations between wartime and peacetime, with indiscriminate weaponry such as killer robots or lethally armed weapons that contribute to the epidemic of violence against historically marginalized groups with their gender-biased and racist algorithms. With the world facing numerous security challenges, including the gendered impact of conflict and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, on the one-year anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and Russia's recent withdrawal from the New START Treaty, a special session on disarmament in 2023 is needed now more than ever to identify concrete measures to strengthen disarmament and arms control efforts, including those related to the gendered impact of armed conflict. This session would also assess progress made in the implementation of existing disarmament communities and explore innovative ways to build trust among nations. So this was a statement written by our panel, and Mona Lisa, I would like to start with you and ask you the very purpose of why we are here. Why do you think we need a special session on disarmament? And a follow-up to that would be, do you think we are being trapped in a Cold War narrative, and do you think we are trapped by our views on the Cold War when it comes to disarmament?
Yeah, absolutely, Zahra. I think I'll just briefly go over what is a special session on disarmament. So it was first conducted in 1978 when the UN member states, particularly the non-aligned countries, requested a special session of the General Assembly devoted entirely on disarmament. So this request was made in regards to the limited possibilities for discussions provided by a regular session of the General Assembly, and was perceived as an opportunity to discuss comprehensive disarmament in a particularly universal forum. So the last session was held in 1988, and of course, a lot has changed since then. So with the new global order, the power dynamics are no longer split between the two directional giants of the West and the East, while nuclear weapons are still pose the overarching existential threat, but are no longer just limited to those two blocks. At present, there are 9 nuclear weapon states, along with 5 other countries which are known to host these weapons in their territories. Also important here is that this gradual shift of power to the east The 21st century has been dubbed as the Asian century, and of course for good reason. Today, the region has an increasing global share of trade, capital, people, knowledge, transport, culture, and resources. But also important to flag here is that this region is also the largest importer of weapons. With new and emerging technology, our world has engaged in this hybrid warfare where the lines between humanity and warfare has been blurred with indiscriminate autonomous weapons like the killer robots, which are known to have inherent gender and racist biases. And to answer your second part of your question, do we still have the Cold War attitudes? I said yes, because Cold War ideology still persists today. We still try to understand international reality in military terms. So this wartime economy has not only resulted in huge divestments from public sectors, but has also fostered these attitudes of mistrust and a permanent armament industry. The doomsday clock, of course, which stands now at 90 seconds to midnight, is a clear indication of that.
Thank you, Mona Lisa. Indrajit, I see you nodding along if you'd like to jump in.
So I actually quite agree with Mona Lisa on this point, but it's not just that the Cold War attitudes have persisted in terms of how we think of these weapons, not just the rationale of these weapons, but the rationale of our solutions as well. So in terms of how we think about disarmament is also very much rooted in this Cold War mentality, Cold War attitude towards the mistrust and the sort of fear-mongering of the ideology of these weapons. I think I actually had to deal with a few diplomats on these issues. And while talking to them, I did realize that it's not just that they think about these weapons as essential, but the ideology with which they approach why these weapons are necessary sort of points to how they look at these, how they look at the issue of disarmament as utopian to begin with. And that is one of the biggest drivers of change which you want, which actually points to another issue which Gurpreet had talked about, is the dominance of the male sort of masculine agenda when we talk about weapons, nuclear weapons, and disarmament as well. I would let Gurpreet talk more about that.
Thank you, Indrajit. I think following on from both Mona Lisa and Indrajit, I think one of the things that we need to recognize today, especially in 2023, is that disarmament is actually deeply connected to other systems of peace and development. And bringing on, the gendered aspect of this is that arms proliferation specifically is embedded into systems such as patriarchy, heteronormativity, racism, ableism, wealth inequality. And these are intersecting vectors and identities held by different groups and communities that inform their relationship to weapons and arms proliferation. The issue is not just related to nuclear weapons, which are associated with male virility through language and symbolic associations to state power and security. They are also related to small arms and light weapons that facilitate sexual and gender-based violence against women. So it relates to a broader issue where intimate partner violence is involved. It even encompasses the sphere of domestic violence. And bringing on your point about, this utopic ideology, which is also very much steeped in a sort of like a gender hierarchy where nuclear states, or states which actually have a lot of these arsenal of weapons, are somehow seen as very, very empowered and masculine states, whereas those who talk about disempowerment or who are not in that narrative are feminine states. And there's a sort of like, when you talk about disempowerment and letting go of certain things, there is this idea of, this is emasculating. We don't project that kind of power. And this is a very, very strong narrative that is there, but no one is actually willing to talk about the gendered aspects of these issues, where it's not just about how, it's not a symbolic currency, but how women are disproportionately affected, LGBTQI communities are disproportionately affected, disabled communities are, not brought onto the table. There is wealth inequality. There is also the question of what we would call as nuclear colonialism, where a lot of indigenous communities are being affected by uranium mining. And it's the states who are actually in power who kind of dump all the nuclear waste on, other indigenous communities that is there. So there's a lot of, these intersections and communities that are actually not being brought up to the table, but particularly the patriarchal aspects that we need to talk about. And I think James can actually elaborate more on the kind of colonial dynamics that are there and take us through that that narrative.
Yeah, of course. I think while we were talking a little bit about there being separate power blocks and the current day situation not really representing a more Cold War era style of relations, I think while, of course, we're at SOAS, we have to interrogate the colonial and also imperialistic view of kind of the current day order as well. And more specifically, as someone growing up, who grew up in Hong Kong, I'm very concerned about U.S.-China relations and what that means, and also kind of what I'm seeing as a rhetoric of fear, I guess, promulgated by both the U.S. side and the Chinese side, that is kind of fueling this arms race in Asia, that is actually detrimental for human security of local communities and me and my family living in Hong Kong right now. And I think if we look at the U.S. Department of Defense says the Chinese rocket force is one of the most dangerous forces and most rapidly growing forces in the world. But if you look at the numbers and look at the actual military balance, the numbers does show an actual difference in that analysis. If we look at the Chinese nuclear warheads arsenal, China has 350 nuclear warheads, but the U.S. has 5,428. And if we even look at just conventional weapons and conventional missiles, China has an inventory of 2,000 conventional and nuclear missiles, whereas simply just the U.S. Itself, with its Navy roaming around the South China Sea with 10 to 14 cruisers or destroyers, each armed with Tomahawk missiles, and the U.S. has around 4,000 in its inventory, and and also has the ability to use JASSM missiles, which are joint air-to-surface standoff missiles that can be deployed from anywhere from transport aircrafts to trucks to traditional fighter jets, and the U.S. has currently 5,000 of them, with plans to buy as many as 10,000 of them, which vastly outnumbers China's, inventory of 2,000. And there is this rhetoric of fear that is also promoting this arms race, which you can see in Japan as well, with Japan's recent purchase of 500 Tomahawk missiles from the U.S. And there's this very masculine terminology used with defense by deterrence and this arms race as kind of detrimental to human security, building off from that.
I actually also wanted to ask you, developing on that, how do you feel about the justification for militarization and increased defense spending, which has percolated into our society? Mona Lisa, I know you mentioned your program called Across the Chicken Neck, which focuses on the militarization of Northeast India. How do you feel that this has been justified there, and is there a need, and what threats have weapons proliferation posed in your local context as well?
Yes, so the Across the Chicken Neck is a program that I created in collaboration with the Youth for Disarmament initiative of the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs. So as part of my training, I created this educational program which aims to accentuate the importance of disarmament education among youth across the globe, with special reference to the indigenous communities of Northeast India. So this project is basically a product of my lived experiences with armed conflict conducted by insurgent groups and separatist groups, and also the impact of illicit trade in small arms and narcotics across the porous borders. So if you've ever seen the Indian map, if you've paid attention, the northeastern part of the country is connected to said mainland India by a narrow 21-kilometer strip of land, which is called the chicken neck, hence comes the name Across the Chicken Neck. So as a youth and an indigenous woman growing up, I could see the first-hand impact of what weapons could do to the social fabric of community, so much so that the weapons and military presence has been normalized in the region. So this project has been highlighting the various cross-cutting issues of this region, including the porous international borders. So we have 98% of our borders are international. We share them with China, Myanmar, Bhutan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. So the close proximity to the Golden Triangle brings in the problem of narcotics within the region. Then we have post-colonial realities fueled by racism. There's also the issues of indigenous rights, human rights violation with a barbaric law called the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, AFSPA, which has been imposed since the early 1950s, and also the problem of uranium mining in the region. So in this regard, there's a lot to unpack through this project. And to answer your question, the problems that we have been facing is mostly, just goes back to weapons proliferation, especially small arms, how they have been traded and smuggled across these borders since the independence of our country. And people, I guess, have just gotten so used to this problem, or I guess have sidelined to the point that this military-industrial complex that has been, like you said, percolated into our society, that it's just been dubbed as that's the way of the world. Or I think a more appropriate one would be guns don't kill people, people kill people, right? But then we are, I guess, conveniently forgetting the fact that it's just us people who are killing these other people. So we are so blinded by this overload of information where we hear cases of deaths with like new and improved weapons, and this humane picture behind these figures and these data is somehow lost. The families and the generations who have to bear the brunt of these weapons and these conflicts are just, I guess, again, I'm rambling, but then this is something so close to my heart that it's not really, I guess, brought to the international level, which is the reason why I created this project. And also to, I guess, highlight how this humanitarian impact of such decisions is conveniently overlooked by the people who says that disarmament, non-proliferation, and arms control is a utopic thing, and the world is always at war, and this is how the world functions.
I think I just want to jump in here and add to what Mona Lisa has said, that through the effects on indigenous communities, what we are seeing is a lot of intersectional and interlinking of these concepts. So a lot of the issues that we are dealing with are also that there is an effect on the environment, right? Arms, and nuclear weapons. They actually, it's not just a biodiversity loss, but indigenous communities are actually being affected. So it is how again a disproportionate gender effect comes in, where a lot of indigenous communities depend on their women to walk miles and miles to fetch clean water, and if that is affected, that is not available, and they have to walk through the forest to collect fuel for firewood for fuel. So it is all an interlinked arena where you can't just talk about, say, disarmament doesn't affect this, or it only affects biodiversity, it doesn't affect that. It is all linked, and at the heart of it, we are talking about women, we are talking about marginalized communities, but also today's biggest threat, something that I think Lucy even touched on, is climate change. We are looking at how a lot of the weapons and the military complex actually contributes to a lot of the greenhouse emissions as well, and how in order to kind of combat that, you're putting in more arsenal that actually creates more of this as well. So I don't think it's a question of we can kind of look at it, these issues like in a like the Cold War framework of there were two blocks of power or just two hierarchies that are there. I think a lot of new voices and issues are coming in that need to be brought to the table. So
just building off of that, I think we had a question earlier talking about how we can get countries like India to sort of play a bigger role in disarmament. So I think what Mona Lisa and Gurpreet have said is sort of, it gives away why sort of in the global south disarmament is such a controversial issue. Because when we think about weapons in general and nuclear weapons in particular, we can think about it in 3 dimensions. The first will be state on state violence, the second will be state on human violence, and the third would be human on human violence. As far as countries of the global south, especially India, is concerned, their nuclear weapons program and their strategic thinkers think about nuclear weapons only as state-on-state violence. They do not consider the other 2 dimensions at all. And even when we are talking about disarmament from a Cold War perspective, the most we can do is the second dimension, that is state on human violence, or state on the effect on environment, or how it's causing loss of biodiversity. But the things which you and Mona Lisa talked about, these 3 things are sort of showing how these issues are interlinked. And the best way to get this agenda sort of bigger voice in Global South is through focusing on this third dimension, this new dimension, to bring it in voices of disarmament, essentially.
Thank you so much. I am just a bit conscious of time, and therefore I would like to ask if there are any questions from the room. But in the meantime, there has been a question on the chat that I would like to ask you. Scrap Weapons, from its start, has included youth perspectives in its design and rollout. What do you think is the strength of this approach, and can you tell us more about how the project is led by and engages student voices? As our student voices, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess with Scrap, we currently have a couple different work streams, and I'm working on the military balance work stream, and I think Gurpreet is working on the gender work stream, and there's also a small arms producers work stream, and they're all led by students, and yeah, I think we each get to kind of direct the work stream towards our interests and towards our local context and our own experiences, and we have articles coming out on our opinions page, our op-eds, blog posts, and to get more youth voices out there, and Scrap's a good platform for that. And yeah, that's kind of small steps that we're taking, I think.
Yeah, I just want to add that I think in that sense, Scrap is amazing because it actually listens to student voices. It gives us a chance to place our opinions and even disagree with our with our supervisors and professors. And in that sense, I think Scrap is doing quite a lot.
I would just like to add that I have been directing the gender intersectionality and disarmament stream, and it's been amazing because I have had so much freedom to work on it and direct it in the way we need to go. So the intersectional aspects that I've been talking about, that's core of the stream that we are talking about. So we are talking about gender, sexuality and disarmament, gender and environment and disarmament, et cetera, et cetera. So we are really, I think, bringing out a lot of the issues that are first and foremost affecting a lot of the youth and trying to highlight youth voices and other marginalized voices that matter. And I think Scrap is leading in that. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sorry,
go on, Ronald.
Sorry, Zahra. Yes, I just wanted to add to what Gurpreet already mentioned about the different initiatives that Scrap is taking. I would like to talk about the webinar series that my team is working on. It's called the In Conversations with the Arms Industry, which is basically, it's scheduled to start from April, which invites actors from the alleged shadow world to partake in a series of open dialogues and provides a practical insights to the arms industry, its preoccupations, and its own understanding of the role in their work. Also, through this webinar series, we will be addressing a variety of themes and issues relating to, well, the business of that, like it's dubbed, by seeking to understand what key challenges these actors face to meet the expectations of ethical conduct and creating a space for conversations that leads toward a more a safer and peaceful world. And so our main aim is to recenter this debate around the ethics, the laws and regulation which governs these arms trade, and narrowing the gap between the social responsibilities and the on-the-ground realities. Over to you, Zara.
Thank you so much. Are there any questions in the room or online? In that case, I would actually like you to respond to the previous question that was asked about our title. What are your thoughts on states being held accountable to what they say?
The question was asked, particularly in India's case, to be held. India's issue with Kashmir is sort of the major highlight because it's such an international issue. But the truth is, as Mona Lisa has also pointed out, India has a lot of human rights issues all over its territories. I'm also from West Bengal, which has a part of the chicken's neck in it. I've also lived in sort of areas which were affected by Maoist insurgencies and Naxal insurgencies, and I've seen that firsthand. I've seen that violence firsthand myself. In that sense, holding India, countries like India accountable is, as I mentioned, you have to focus on the third dimension of the violence, which is human-on-human violence. India will always, essentially any country in the global south which wants to be taken seriously in the nuclear five will always focus on state-on-state violence because, nuclear colonialism or nuclear orientalism is a reality for the diplomatic future of these countries. But in terms of holding them accountable for what is going on and advancing a serious debate on disarmament here requires us to force these countries to look at themselves in a way which is commensurate not with the agenda of nuclear weapons or the international order, but of violence and weapons at a much smaller scale, because that is what will build up that tension in the public, because at the end it is a democracy. And as you said, that there's this trickle-down democracy concept, and that may work at some level, hopefully.
James, I would like to ask your opinion on this outside of the India context.
Sure. I will take a creative spin off that. I think based on my research, I think it's important to look at capabilities and not simply just what states say or intentions or representations. And I think data speaks for itself. And sometimes I think it's important to include both the data and also dialogue as well.
All right, thank you all so much for joining us for this panel, and thank you guys for introducing and discussing aspects of disarmament that are usually not brought up from all walks and different levels of society and life. So thank you so much.